letting you know you're not alone.
I wanna try to understand. I wanna help if I can. Wonder what we all are thinking, something in the silence speaking. I wanna try to understand. But if it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally. I could be your ally. I wanna take that step with you. Wanna do more than what I say I'll do. Gotta find a way to stand up. Wishing just isn't enough. I wanna take that step with you. But if it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally. If it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally.
Letting you know you're not alone. Letting you know you're not alone. Letting me know you're not alone. Letting me know you're not alone. Letting me know you're not alone.
Wonder what we all are thinking, something in the silence speaking. I wanna try to understand. But if it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally. I could be your ally. I wanna take that step with you. Wanna do more than what I say I'll do. Gotta find a way to stand up. Wishing just isn't enough. I wanna take that step with you. But if it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally. If it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally.
Letting you know you're not alone. Letting you know you're not alone. Letting me 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 know you're not alone.
But if it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally. If it doesn't feel right on the outside, maybe from the inside, I could be your ally. I could be your ally. I could be your ally.
Ever since the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was passed in Paris in 1948 on December the 10th, we have fostered the observance of this day not only in the United States but throughout the world. The object is to make people everywhere conscious of the importance of human rights and freedoms, to emphasize also for all of us the fact that the building of human rights would be one of the foundation stones on which we would build in the world an atmosphere in which peace could grow.
We are standing at a precipice. We can either look down and be paralyzed by what is broken, or we can look ahead, organize, and mobilize to fix all that we can. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights followed a war that claimed an estimated 60 million lives worldwide. It inflicted atrocities on a scale unseen by history and destroyed the global economy. At the end of World War II, who could have imagined that only 3 short years later, on this date in 1948, nations that had recently been enemies would gather in Paris to enshrine the human rights of all people and permanently change the moral terrain of a broken world. At Article3.org, we seek to create an environment where we can learn from each other. We've been called to take the legal and theoretical aspects of the human rights movement from the halls of global institutions to the ground, to support young rising leaders who come from diverse and resilient communities who fight through the fatigue of their work every day, to achieve a vision for a better future. History shows us that out of the deepest destruction and pain come the greatest opportunities. We find ourselves at a similar inflection point, and we're obligated to build a better world. Welcome to International Human Rights Day.
Hello, I'm Darian Weltman-Swig, co-founder of Article3.org. On behalf of my partner, David Keller, and all of us at Article3.org, welcome to our celebration of International Human Rights Day. It feels so good to be back here at SF Jazz in San Francisco to mark this special occasion with so many of you, and to see the chat box light up with names of our friends and supporters from cities and countries around the world. From wherever you are joining us for Human Rights Day, we are together in the ways that matter most. Together in our commitment to honoring defenders of human rights and democracy around the world. And together in our resolve to uphold the values and principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration established for the first time under international law that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And Article 3, the inspiration for our name, declared that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Today, those sentences at the foundation of international human rights law may seem self-evident, yet as the events of this year have so poignantly driven home, we cannot take for granted that these legal standards will be upheld. They must be defended and enforced. We observe Human Rights Day at the end of a year in which violence, loss, and suffering seem beyond measure. A year that saw systematic rollbacks of civil society, press freedoms, and minority rights, especially the rights of women and girls. A year that saw a tide of lies threatening to overwhelm the truth in too many countries, including right here in the United States. And yet, against this backdrop, we can also see cause for hope. In Ukraine, in Russia, in Iran, in China, in Myanmar, in the US Congress, and elsewhere, we saw defenders of human rights and democracy join together and defy the aggressive narrative and tactics. We saw journalists and brave bystanders bear witness and expose truths and collect evidence. In honor of these courageous acts, we have selected as this year's theme, Justice Through Accountability. Over the next hour, we will explore the challenge and the promise of justice through accountability. Not only how we can hold perpetrators to account, but just as importantly, how to give voice to survivors and how to strengthen society as a whole through the rule of law. This approach is so critical that this year we will recognize not one, but two master practitioners and remarkable leaders who have made justice through accountability their life's work. We are delighted to recognize Amal Clooney with the Article 3 Human Rights Global Treasure Award for her remarkable work in waging justice on behalf of women and girls, journalists, and people throughout the world who've experienced persecution and exile. And we will honor Ken Roth, one of the architects of the modern human rights movement, for his lifetime achievement as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. We hope you enjoy the program. Now let's get started.
Hello, I'm Beth Van Schok, and it is my honor to address you as the 6th U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. I started this position during a time of extraordinary challenges and opportunities in pursuing peace through justice and accountability. My job and the mission of my office is to engage in diplomacy and programming to help prevent and respond to atrocities around the world. On this International Human Rights Day, I join these distinguished leaders in exploring emerging trends that can help us discover new ways to advance lasting peace through justice, while reaffirming our commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. First, I want to congratulate my dear friend Amal Clooney for her award today. Her relentless work in the pursuit of justice for vulnerable populations in some of the most disturbing conflicts of the world have been exemplary. And I join Article3.org in its tribute to Ken Roth for his 30 amazing years of outstanding service in the field of human rights. With my short remarks today, I'd like to highlight 3 emerging areas that would benefit from additional conceptual and financial investments from the international community, including advocates and philanthropists. Although much attention has been paid to the promise of open source investigations, the testimony of witnesses remains essential in complex prosecutions involving war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, and genocide. As such, I have made the protection of victims and witnesses, including insider witnesses, in the investigation and prosecution of these atrocities as one of my key priorities. I look forward to collaborating with others inside and outside of government to identify new policies and resources to support and protect witnesses, as their contributions are critical to our collective justice efforts. We also recognize that the various manifestations of climate change, including mass deforestation and drought, are critical drivers of a conflict and risk factors for mass atrocities, particularly against vulnerable populations, including women and girls. Consistent with the President's vision on combating climate change, my office is working with other governmental and non-governmental partners to develop policies to address issues related to international crimes in advancing climate justice. And as we think innovatively about partnerships in justice and accountability, we cannot lose sight of the role that corporations and those who run and invest in them can play in enabling the commission of atrocity crimes, but also potentially being forces for good. The international community can do more to ensure that there are tangible consequences to negative corporate conduct, whether it be reputational harms, financial sanctions, or potentially criminal penalties. Case in point is the recent plea agreement by Lafarge Hossein, in which the company admitted to revenue sharing with ISIS and to pay $788 million in fines and forfeiture to the U.S. Department of Justice. France is also pursuing a criminal case against the company, alleging its complicity in ISIS crimes against humanity in Syria. Swedish authorities are also currently pursuing criminal charges against the chairman and the former CEO of Lundin Oil, accusing him of complicity in war crimes carried out by Sudanese army and allied militia, operating in an area where the company planned to carry out oil exploration in what is now South Sudan. It is important for corporate actors to know that facilitating, encouraging, or aiding the commission of mass atrocities and human rights abuses is not only morally wrong, but can and will impact their bottom line. To that end, the United States uses a suite of tools, including sanctions, licensing restrictions, and legal compliance requirements. The recently passed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, for example, creates a rebuttable presumption that goods emanating from the Xinjiang region were produced with the forced labor of Uyghurs. And so I call on all of us, government, civil society, philanthropists, and the private sector alike, to continue working toward innovative solutions, forging new partnerships, and investing in the areas of witness protection, corporate responsibility, and climate justice to enhance existing pathways for pursuing justice for victims and survivors around the world. And now I'd like to hand it over to Karim Khan, Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one of the most momentous and impactful legal charters that has been drafted in the history of humanity. I'm therefore really delighted to say a few words during today's program on Human Rights Day. I was inspired as a young boy by Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan, who was there with Eleanor Roosevelt as the head of Pakistan's delegation when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted. I heard so many stories about that process, and of course he wrote an important publication, Islam and Human Rights, in which he also emphasized the universality of human rights, that they are not the preserve of the West or of the East or of any particular religion. They find form and they resonate in our very humanity. It is really a delight to congratulate my dear friend Amal Clooney on her award of the Human Rights Global Treasure Award today, and also for the lifetime of service to Ken Roth for the very well-deserved recognition that underscores many years, if not decades, of service to the rule of law and human rights, to many that simply would otherwise be invisible. Amal in particular deserves a massive amount of thanks by me personally. Her inspiring leadership, her brilliant legal acumen, and her persistent stubbornness really helped the Security Council to pass Resolution 2379 that established the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for the crimes of ISIS. And the work of Nadia Murad and the wonderful legal direction and indefatigable energy of Amal really was something to behold. Amal's work, of course, has gone well beyond the crimes of ISIS, but including fighting fearlessly for journalists that are targeted in too many countries of the world, simply for being the watchdogs of democratic societies, putting a spotlight upon power and making sure that that unbridled targeting must end. And I also have the great honor that Amal accepted an invitation to be my special advisor on Sudan, which is a testament for the many years of work that she's done in Sudan, and of course also her husband, George Clooney. And the Clooney Foundation for Justice, if anybody looks at their Twitter feed or looks at their website, it's amazing at the breadth of work they are doing, whether it's their fair trials, their docket, or their other work around the world, really to put human rights center stage. Ken, of course, your work and your involvement with the office could be spoken about for an awful long period of time. But I'm really delighted to be able to acknowledge both of you today, and your recognition is really very well deserved. Of course, the International Criminal Court its primary responsibility is not human rights. It is violations of international criminal law that almost always involve human rights breaches. We're in a pivotal moment. Human rights are under stress in so many countries with the forces of despotism, of nationalism, of different types of power politics which seem to wish to suffocate or subdue the flight of the soul, the flight of the individual, to live life freely, in liberty and in security. And this is why we must never tire of human rights. It should never become passé. It should never become something that is boring, that we've seen there, we've seen that, we've heard about it, and move on. Out of all the values, human rights have to be struggled for, and it is a torch that must be passed to the next generation so that it never loses its luster and its ability to illuminate in the very darkest of places. So at this moment, we need a new common front of legality in which international institutions like the International Criminal Court and my office work shoulder to shoulder with the United Nations, with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, with the special procedure mandates in Genevas, with civil society organizations, with giants like the two that you are honoring today, who have been willing to speak up, even though many would rather they quieten down. Their refusal to be muzzled must inspire us not to be muzzled. Their refusal to lose hope must inspire us to march forward, not in despair or despondency, but in a belief that we are custodians for a few moments in time. And if we work together and believe there can be a better future, there will be. If we feel that resistance is futile, if we feel the mountain of human rights and the abuses we see are too steep to conquer, we will give in to despair. I am sure all of you watching have no despair, see things very keenly, and realize for all the difficulties we are re-galvanized to action with a steely determination to pass on to our children a better and a safer future than we see for so many of our children, our women and men today. So we need to go forward together with determination, with focus, to vindicate the promise and indeed the obligations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two 1966 Bill of Rights and the panoply of other international human rights and international criminal law conventions that they ultimately gave birth to. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Randy Newcomb, an Article3.org board member and senior advisor at the Omidyar Group. I'm so pleased today to be moderating this year's Human Rights Day panel discussion on the subject of pursuing justice through accountability. Animating today's conversation is the conviction that the rule of law, administered by a functioning judicial system, is what separates democracies from autocracies. As John Locke said, wherever law ends, tyranny begins. Joining us today are Noura Al-Jazawi, a researcher at the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, Kawaga Ghani, journalist and visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Human Rights Center, Tarana Hassan, acting executive director of Human Rights Watch, and Anya Neistat, legal director of the Docket, the War Crimes Investigation Unit of the Clooney Foundation for Justice. Welcome, everybody. Anya, I want to turn to you first to help lay the foundation for the emergence of these key tools for pursuing justice through accountability. I'm seeing more and more being written about the principle of universal jurisdiction as an increasingly effective tool.
It is the idea of making justice universal. And I think humanity has been playing with this idea, or around this idea, for a long time. And in some ways, I think the increased attention that we're now seeing to universal jurisdiction is due to, in my opinion, two factors. One, a certain disillusionment with the more traditional human rights methodology that human rights movement used for decades and that worked well. The notorious naming and shaming, which many are now shying away from, although we have to remember that this tool was so popular because it was effective. And increasingly, I would say, especially over the last decade, we started seeing the imperviousness of those whom we're trying to name and shame and started looking for other tools. And I would say coincidentally, we started seeing increased willingness of national authorities to take justice forward. It turns out that more than 170 countries in the world have broadly speaking, universal jurisdiction provisions for at least one of the international crimes. So it exists. It's currently being used only by a handful of countries, but I think it is in our hands, in the hands of human rights activists and lawyers, to make international justice truly universal.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I mean, obviously, we're having this conversation in the context of I think where you are, close where you are right now to Ukraine and related to the Russian aggression. And can you offer some thinking or some insight about the application of international criminal law in national jurisdictions and what that relationship to universal jurisdiction might be?
I think Ukraine does present a unique opportunity. It is, we're seeing some of the most horrendous crimes being committed. We're seeing an open act of aggression of one country against the other, but we're also seeing definitely in my professional career for the first time such, I would say, excitement and willingness to bring the perpetrators to justice. We see that already 13, if I'm not mistaken, countries have opened their own investigation. And these are some of the usual suspects, such as Germany and France, but also some countries that have never touched universal jurisdiction before. And now that we see East European countries in this orbit, it already gives us hope that it's becoming broader than it used to be. There are lots of NGOs, journalists, prosecutors working on the ground to collect evidence. And so I am very hopeful that it will not only bring justice to Ukrainian survivors at large and mass, but also be a moment where we actually revive the principle of universal jurisdiction and make it a go-to, one of the go-to mechanisms for delivering justice for other situations that might be similar to Ukraine.
Tarana, can you help us understand about how you see more broadly, how you see the function of special tribunals at a moment like at this moment in time in modern history?
I think that the role of special tribunals is really important, and it's one that we really can't underestimate the importance of moving forward. But one of the reasons it's increasingly important is because domestic prosecutions are incredibly difficult. Particularly when you're in a situation of conflict or crisis or post-conflict recovery. It's not always the case that you have a functioning judiciary that's able to actually have the infrastructure, the judicial capacity to be able to prosecute serious crimes, and particularly war crimes. So this is where the idea of the hybrid tribunals is really key. And it's really that special space in between the crimes that could be heard in the International Criminal Court, for example, and the crimes that could be heard domestically. There's a big gap in between those. And this is where you have the hybrid courts really playing a role. But I want to point out one thing, which is applicable to Ukraine, but also every other situation we're talking about. And that is that justice isn't sustained on a diet of outrage. And there is rightly considerable outrage right now, just at the magnitude, gravity, and severity of the violations that we're seeing in Ukraine. But the outrage is a catalyst. And one of the things that we have learned the hard way, I would say, as a human rights movement and as organizations who are pursuing justice, is that you don't have the stamina sometimes to actually deliver on justice. And that is a risk that we're going to have in Ukraine as well. And I think that, we have several of the elements there, but we know that justice and accountability processes and the success of a tribunal, these all take time. This is the long game. There are no quick fixes when it comes to international justice. So it really is about, will there be the political will and adequate resourcing to be able to take this forward?
I want to turn now and talk a little bit about this kind of understanding this more central role of victims and survivors and really their voice that plays in accountability. And Kwaga, you and I have gotten acquainted here most recently. You bring this very interesting perspective of being both a journalist who covered the war in Afghanistan, and then after the Taliban recaptured the country in 2021, you had to flee.
Not just because I am a journalist, but as a human being. My feelings have been tortured. My rights have been tortured. I still have the trauma. I still miss my country. I still go through the journey that I went through, the way I fled the country, the way I was treated.
Noura, I want to turn to you. In a recent interview that I read, you made a comment about your decision to join the demonstrations in Syria, which would actually lead to you being detained and eventually tortured. And you tell this beautiful story. You describe not being able to find your words initially on the very day that you joined these demonstrations, but eventually your first word was freedom.
Yeah, when the protests started, I was 23 years old. But honestly, it was so hard for a person who, under authoritarianism, remained speechless, had no voice, it's only 1 second when you have the decision and you say, now I have a voice. Now this is me, the word, and this people, the regime and the regime soldiers, everyone should listen that I am here, I exist, we exist as people, and people we demand our freedom, we demand our dignity. And what happened next is details. The big moment was there.
There was an international campaign that was led by Reporters Without Borders. I believe it was 2012. You correct me if I'm wrong, but that led to you being released from jail. You were able to flee to Turkey, and while in Turkey, you founded this NGO called Start Point, which really was dedicated to human rights and psychosocial support for Syrian women and girls who, like you, had been detained and tortured.
When I was released, and there's it was too much to process all of this information, to understand the campaign, who was involved in this campaign, and the impact of this campaign basically protecting me from being heavily tortured or from being enforcibly disappeared forever. It led ultimately to my release. But when I was released, when I knew that it was only for me, it was not for everybody, and it's not fair. The guilt was killing me, and I couldn't stop thinking about people I left behind. You feel like the freedom at that moment, it's meaningless because it's not only about me, it's about everyone else, children, women, seniors, amazing youth who would be at some point the ones who will create and build this country again. So I decided when I felt like I'm enjoying a relative degree of safety, I can do something to help others. Through Start Point, I made a great shift to meet amazing people from CVT, the organization that ultimately I'm sitting on the board now. And we put the ideas together. This is how the idea developed too. It's not only about telling the story. We are not entitled to tell the story of others. They should be the ones who are telling their stories. And it was all of these thoughts and debates about documentation versus the supporting victims. But then we said we can do both. And victims are not, it's not fair to call them survivors immediately. Survivor is a long bridge and they need to cross it, not alone. We can be with them. We can help them to cross from being victims to being survivors, to support others. But the first thing is having their stories documented, having their voice heard, because without this, there's no room for human rights activism, and there's no room for advocacy for the ones who are still left behind.
Telling the story of people who are impacted is everything about, I mean, we've just heard these stories. They are stories of immense courage, but they are stories of fact, which tell us who is responsible, what happened, what they did. And that should be, and it plays a key role in providing the impetus for why justice and accountability is important. This idea of, if you want to hold people accountable for the crimes that they've committed, but also hold them accountable to ensure that it's a deterrent for future crimes that they're going to commit, then you need to have the evidence from these people. You need to hear their stories. These are the most powerful tools that we have to actually often create the political will that is required for justice and accountability stories. When you talk about the role of the media, there was recently a trial, I'm sure Nora is very familiar with this, in Koblenz in Germany, which was a trial of universal jurisdiction, which actually saw for the first time somebody from the Syrian security apparatus actually convicted for torture, for crimes against humanity. And one of the key pieces of evidence that was used there was actually, there were 27,000 photographs that came out of Syria that were analyzed for that case, around 6,000 plus victims. And they were smuggled out by somebody who goes under the pseudonym Caesar. And these photos came and they were victims of torture. They ended up being used as evidence in this case. They were a very important part of the case. And the person who testified at that case about those photos and their interaction with Caesar, the person who smuggled the photos out, was a journalist. So journalists are not only playing a role in telling the story, they're playing a role also in providing key pieces of evidence that are responsible for, potentially seeing perpetrators and abusers in the dock and ultimately convicted.
Recent trips to Ukraine were just such a stark reminder of why we're all doing this. It's just so easy, no matter how inspired we are by all the processes that are happening out there, to get personally disappointed and tired because justice takes such a long time. And it's usually one step forward and two steps back, as colleagues here know very well. But then it is just the inspiration and kind of the power that you get from speaking to people who just experienced some of the most horrendous things in their lives, and who tell you, we want to go forward. When you really start feeling that you are the tool that they can use to get justice, that it's not you coming and imposing some, idea of international justice and dragging them into this net, but rather them saying, we don't know how you're going to do this, but we want to go all the way to make sure that the perpetrators get punished. And that, as Nora was saying, that it doesn't happen again. They know very well that it will not bring their relatives back, and probably will only partially heal the trauma that they experienced themselves. But nonetheless, it's just this intuitive understanding of what justice is all about is always just blowing me away. And one other thing, just on the media, I think for me personally right now, it's critically important to keep talking about all these boring legal issues in the ways that people understand. And that's why, our work is such that we do not talk very much about the actual cases that we're pursuing. So it's kind of slightly difficult because we're working a lot with the prosecutors and there are lots of things that cannot go public. But just the idea, for me, basically all of these universal jurisdictional processes, all of the processes in ICC or international tribunals are only of very limited effectiveness if people are not talking about them. Because when people start talking about them, because it is in the media, that's how the word gets to the perpetrators. And that's how the deterrence effect is created. It's all about making the world small for the perpetrators, but also amplifying this message about how small the world will be for you if you're involved in war crimes or other criminal acts.
I want to ask a big final question. Someone has said that history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I'm curious, from your perspectives from Afghanistan, from Syria, from where all of you sit at this moment, from where you sit, where is history rhyming and what requires our attention at this moment in time?
For Afghanistan, the history has been rhyming for decades, especially for women. We thought in the last 20 years that women were able to achieve some of those very basic rights that they had. They tried, they worked hard for it to achieve what they wanted to achieve, just the simple rights that they needed, that the choice of what to wear, the choice of who to marry, the choice of getting educated, the choice of working where they wanted to work, the basic rights that they thought they achieved. And once again, from 50%, they went back to zero.
Usually I love to be optimistic, but at this point, I cannot. Unfortunately, we're seeing this global trend of authoritarianism. Even some liberal democracies are regretting and now started adopting new tactics or some means of authoritarianism and dictatorship. But unfortunately, what we are seeing more and more is not only the authoritarianism growing and expanding in the countries, in the territorial borders of these countries, but also beyond their borders. And speaking about the international advocacy that victims, survivors, and human rights defenders are carrying out in exile, the growing role of diaspora communities in holding the regimes accountable. On the other hand, it has also the risk of putting them under direct threat and making them targets of these regimes in their exile. And we are seeing this growing more and more. And the thinking of the digital technology and how digital technology is also empowering this regime to expand more and more their authoritarianism beyond the borders. Something, these attempts to intimidate, to silence, to repress the exiled human rights defenders and activists is also giving us hope, giving us the sign that all of these efforts are meaningful. And this gathering of people from different diaspora communities and all of these efforts that are happening beyond these territorial borders of these countries is literally hurting these regimes. Back 2011, social media was our space, was our free parliament, but now they are invading us there. So this invasion is being attempt. I can characterize that as attempts to silence us, to take from us our only weapon, because usually when we say about the rule of civil society, we say solidarity is our only weapon. But now if they are trying to take our solidarity, if they try to occupy our spaces, we will never have space to collaborate. We will never have space to express and to keep telling the story. This is how I'm saying, it's not only about the physical practice of expanding authoritarianism, but also it's about the expanding of attempts and how the regimes, the authoritarian regimes, are being empowered more and more to repress and to silence and to attack journalists, human rights defenders, and survivors.
For everybody who's watching this around the world, I want to thank all four of you for telling your story, for joining us today, and for your courageous leadership in this effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal, for your work for justice for Darfurian people. We thought that we were alone in this world, but finally we recognize that there are good people like you, Amal, trying to put the things in right order so that all the people around the world can live together with same dignity and same rights.
Amal has always combined incredible passion for human rights with unparalleled expertise on how to take action. She's never daunted by the scope of the injustices she takes on, and is not afraid to forge entirely new paths to justice. Even when we face huge obstacles, her legal creativity, drive, and compassion make it impossible to give up hope.
Reuters reporters Walloon and Chassa'u risked their lives and their freedom to fairly report the truth. They exposed a massacre of Rohingya men and boys and should have been commended. Instead, they were set up, convicted, and imprisoned. The community of nations cannot condone this. We must stand for the rule of law and the practice of democracy. Reuters is grateful for all those who stood by Walloon and Chassa'u, Reuters staff, journalists around the world, press freedom groups, governments and diplomats, and legal advocates like Amal Clooney, who fought tirelessly for their release.
Like all journalists, I'm a huge fan of Amal Clooney. Amal has been such a tremendous contributor to press freedom around the world, and my own experience with her are so deeply memorable. When Walloon and Chassa'u were imprisoned in Myanmar and Amal came onto the defense team, she gave us such a lift. Her strategic brilliance, her litigating skill, her negotiating skill, and also her ability to project the outrage to people around the world. Amal uses her fame, uses her prominence to such good effect that she uses it to do good in the world.
On behalf of Reuters, I want to take the opportunity to thank Amal for supporting our mission of delivering independent, reliable news in the global public interest.
I feel so lucky to have her represent Yazidis in court, to call her a personal friend, and to be able to learn so much from her along the way about how we can make sure the law serves our people.
My community appreciates your work highly, and thank you for this justice, and thank you so much for everything.
We live at a time when lies spread faster than facts, paving the way for the collapse of democratic institutions and rule of law all around the world. When that happens, those of us on the front lines are defenseless, and those who defend us are saviors. That's why it gives me tremendous pleasure to honor Amal Clooney, who receives this year's Human Rights Global Treasure Award. She has a fastidious attention to detail, yet pulls out to a global view to find the right path forward, balancing ideals and pragmatism for real-world impact. She not only works in each country's legal system, and you know how different that can be, but has step by step discovered and helped plug holes in the international justice system by creating the Clooney Foundation for Justice. I first met her at the launch of Trial Watch, which puts court observers in remote places of the world to help shine the light in what could otherwise be sham procedures to prevent lawfare when the law is weaponized. The victims are human rights advocates and journalists, women and girls, LGBTQ+, the minorities, victims of genocide and crimes against humanity. They are targeted because we stand up to power and demand better. I know this firsthand because it's never been more dangerous to report the news. One Christmas Eve, I knew she was working because she sent me an email calculating exactly how much jail time I face. More than 103 years. So I also learned a lesson. Don't open an email from Amal Clooney on Christmas Eve. More than that, she's not only my lawyer, she's also my friend. When you're at the receiving end of injustice, it is so rare to find strategy, tactics, and what has become a rare quality, empathy, all in one person. She's always said her goal is to protect the persecuted and prosecute the perpetrators. That's exactly what she does. In her words, waging justice one case at a time. Congratulations, Amal. More power to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to Maria for that really kind introduction. Maria, you are not only my client, you're not only a brilliant journalist and Nobel laureate, you're also one of the most courageous people I've ever met and someone I feel really lucky to call a friend. Thank you as well to Darian Swig, David Keller, and the entire Article 3 team for all of their work to promote philanthropy for human rights. It's a great honor to receive this year's Human Rights Global Treasure Award. And I'd also like to extend my congratulations to a brilliant colleague, Ken Roth, for the Lifetime Achievement tribute that he is receiving today. So this award ceremony is taking place on Human Rights Day, December the 10th, and that's in commemoration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed on this day 75 years ago, in the aftermath, of course, of the genocide committed by the Nazi regime. So on this day in 1948, the 58 nations that formed the United Nations at that time agreed for the first time on a list of universal rights. The Universal Declaration set out the appropriate limits on the power of the state and defined the fundamental freedoms that every individual is entitled to simply by virtue of being human. Rights like freedom of speech and protest, and freedom from slavery and torture. There are surely few historical developments more significant than the realization that individuals who have power should not be free to enslave, torture, and silence those who do not. As the French jurist René Cassin, one of the Declaration's drafters, argued at the time, we do not want a repetition of what happened in 1933, when Germany began to massacre its own nationals, and everybody bowed, saying, "Thou art sovereign and master in thine own house." The Declaration's goals are as relevant today as they were when they were adopted a lifetime ago, but we remain shamefully far from achieving them. Women are still denied equal treatment, a scourge that holds back half the population in countries across the globe. Journalists are put behind bars for simply reporting the truth. Survivors of genocide, like the Yazidis and the Rohingyas, still await a judicial reckoning. It is this status quo that the Clooney Foundation fights to change, by waging justice, as we call it, now in over 40 countries. Our Trial Watch program has led to innocent journalists, women, and minorities being freed from imprisonment after we monitored and exposed their sham trials. Our Docket program is gathering evidence of war crimes from Congo to Venezuela, Sudan, and now Ukraine, sharing the evidence with prosecutors and representing victims in trials against the perpetrators. And our new women's initiative has already helped to secure the right of pregnant and married schoolgirls in Tanzania to complete their education. Yet we are still in an age of impunity, where powerful leaders can lock up critics and even commit crimes against humanity without consequence. The fight for human rights is, in so many places, still so basic. A fight for the right to go to school, to decide who to marry, to state an opinion, even just to show your hair. Rights in many places are sliding backwards. Ask women in Afghanistan. And autocracies now outnumber democracies around the world. Now, I don't say all of this so that we can feel depressed. I'm saying it so that we can remain committed to the work that everyone gathered here is doing. It is why the mission of organizations like Article 3 that seek to galvanize philanthropy for human rights is so essential. When we set up the Clooney Foundation, George and I were shocked to find out that funding for justice-related projects only comprises 1% of total aid worldwide. We have to do better, and this cannot wait. As we are all watching Russia commit war crimes in Ukraine today, I'm reminded of the words of Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Vyshinsky, who was in power when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted 75 years ago. He described the Declaration as nothing but a collection of pious phrases. And I can think of few objectives more worthwhile than proving him wrong. So thank you very much for this great honor, and thank you for all that you do to wage justice. I look forward to continuing this work together.
Thank you, Amal, for your inspiring words. You are indeed a human rights global treasure. It's now my honor to recognize a leader in our movement who many of us have had the privilege of working with for years. He is an attorney, a strategist, a writer, a storyteller, a generous mentor, and above all, a visionary who has had a huge hand in making the global human rights movement what it is, a platform for action, change, and upholding the human dignity around the world. It may be hard to remember, or for the younger members of our movement to even believe, but our field used to have a reputation within the legal community and among policymakers as the province of idealists, people whose hearts were in the right place, but who struggled to put their ideals into practice and were considered no match for those in positions of power. Then came along Ken Roth and Human Rights Watch. Under Ken's leadership for the past 30 years, the organization grew from some 60 researchers who excelled at documenting and exposing human rights abuses into a team of more than 500 with one overarching strategy: to apply the meticulous documentation produced by Human Rights Watch as a tool for exerting direct pressure on policymakers and government officials to change abusive behaviors and enforce rights and laws. During Ken's tenure, Human Rights Watch shared the Nobel Peace Prize for banning landmines, helped to advocate for the creation of the International Criminal Court, and passed laws banning children in the military, just to name a few of HRW's achievements. Human Rights Watch reports are famous not only for framing and publicizing human rights abuses through the media, but also for providing information to the United Nations, NGO partners, and the International Criminal Court. In addition to documenting and exposing abuses, Human Rights Watch employs staff members skilled at establishing tribunals, collecting evidence, bringing pressure on governments with regional influence over countries committing abuses. Ken's work embodies the theme of our program, Justice Through Accountability. Over the years, Ken issued a series of quarterly memos to the staff and board that he titled simply, "What I've Been Up To." And like many, I looked forward to each edition, so rich with Ken's experience and unique perspective on human rights challenges. Ken's briefs are direct and to the point. They are colorful, they are unsparing if warranted of the most powerful leaders in the world, including a succession of US presidents. They are equally gracious in naming and lifting up the work of unsung heroes around the world who take on the hard and dangerous task of confronting their own governments in their countries where such speech is not protected. Ken's memos are a case study in justice through accountability. The final one arrived in August, packed with updates and insights from his team's work in Ukraine and Russia, China, Kenya, and Uganda and elsewhere. And with that note, Ken stepped away from 30 years leading Human Rights Watch to devote himself to other pursuits, including writing a book that I feel certain will inspire the next generation of activists who will continue his world-changing work. While I knew this day was coming, it was indeed a bittersweet moment. Ken will be missed in this role, but it will be wonderful to see how he evolves in this next chapter of his life. I'm so grateful that Ken is with us today to share his thoughts on the challenges and opportunities we face going forward. With gratitude and respect from all of us, please welcome Ken Roth.
Thank you, Darian, and Article 3. I am deeply honored to be recognized today. It means an enormous amount to me. I realize that I'm being honored for my past work, but I suppose, as is typical of me, I would like to focus on the present and the future. And frankly, as I look around the world today, I'm worried. In the global contest between democracy and autocracy, it increasingly seems as if the winner is none of the above. Yes, the autocrats are making a compelling case for the dangers of their unaccountable rule. When you surround yourself by yes men, suppress public debate, and prioritize your own power over the public's welfare, big mistakes are inevitable. Putin's catastrophic invasion of Ukraine would almost certainly never have happened had there been any meaningful checks and balances on his one-man rule. Only in an echo chamber of one could war be the product of his delusional beliefs that Ukraine is somehow a fiction and that he's entitled to eradicate any Ukrainian who resists his efforts to reconstitute the Russian Empire. Xi Jinping, similarly unfettered by public debate or independent institutions, has consecrated his likely president for life status with a series of disastrous decisions. To assert the superiority of Han Chinese culture, he's locked up 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, and their language. To avoid dependency on highly effective Western mRNA vaccines, he has resorted to draconian zero COVID lockdowns with no end in sight. To impede any competing centers of power, he has undercut the most dynamic sectors of the Chinese economy. In a democracy, such devastating policies could be criticized and corrected, but the autocrat can never admit to being wrong, because to recognize fallibility is to weaken his claim to unfettered rule. Instead, Putin sends more young men to die as cannon fodder in Ukraine, and Xi doubles down on his zero COVID lockdowns. Seeing the devastation wrought by the autocrats, publics around the world are making clear their preference for democracy. Sometimes these public protests work, such as recently in Sri Lanka. Sometimes the ballot box succeeds in ousting an autocrat, as in Brazil. But sometimes repression prevails, at least for now. Xi Jinping claims the Chinese people accept his dictatorship in return for economic growth. Never mind that they were never given the choice. But in Hong Kong, the one part of Beijing-controlled China where people could speak out freely, the people made clear that the last thing they wanted was his Communist Party dictatorship. So he crushed their freedoms and imposed his rule. Now, the autocrats do have the advantage of enormous violence at their disposal. That's what we've seen in Sudan, Myanmar, Russia, Belarus, Cuba, and Nicaragua. But when the only remaining foundation for the rule of the autocrat is the brutality of their security forces, all remaining legitimacy is lost. That is not a good long-term strategy. Yet, proponents of democracy should not become complacent. Autocracy is unpopular, but many people in democratic countries are also giving up on democracy. And it's not just the disturbing number of Trump-like people who refuse to recognize the results of any election that their side does not win. There's also a growing challenge to the basic human rights that are essential to democracy. A growing number of politicians are gaining electoral support with explicitly anti-rights platforms. Throughout Europe and the United States, Far-right leaders are decrying the dangers of immigration to the point of shredding the right of people fleeing war and persecution to have their claims to asylum heard and fairly considered. Promoting supposed traditional values, far-right leaders are finding it politically profitable to demonize LGBT people, or to articulate a retrograde vision for women in which they once again are relegated to the home and denied full participation in public life. Human rights defenders like to point out that none of our rights are secure if the rights of anyone are being violated. Today them, tomorrow us, we like to say. But the growing right-wing challenge to rights does not accept that syllogism. The far right simply excludes certain people from the community, assuming that mistreating these supposed outsiders will not affect the rights of people still deemed to be on the inside. Now, why is this happening? In part, it reflects a more materially advanced world in which people are less concerned about obtaining the physical necessities of life, and so give greater priority to cultural issues. In part, it reflects the attributes of the modern era, the greater mobility, the global connections, the faster pace of change, which can be disconcerting. And in part, it reflects a growing sense by some people that they're being left behind, that the opportunities for a better life have become constricted, that members of the governing elite are ignoring them, that they are regarded with contempt rather than the respect that they seek and deserve. None of these developments is easy to remedy. The forces that rend our society are powerful. But to defend democracy, we must address these threats to its core. It's not enough to speak about the importance of rights. We must also rebuild the sense of community that we seem to have lost. To regard even unpopular minorities as worthy of having rights requires recognizing that we are all members of a political and human community. Defending democracy isn't just a matter of fighting particular human rights abuses. We need to address the social fabric on which human rights ultimately depend. The autocrats, through their self-serving mismanagement, have again spotlighted for the world the importance of accountable government. But if democratic societies are to take advantage of this opportunity, we must rebuild the sense of community that is in such dire disrepair. Rights-respecting democracy will have a hard time thriving without it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, for paving the way and inspiring our community to continue the journey. Justice is waged systematically, one case, one witness, one piece of evidence at a time. The opportunity to realize human rights and to see that abusers are held to account may be sparked in the streets, fueled by courageous journalists, and supported by ordinary people. But ultimately, justice requires deliberate, unbiased, and forceful administration through the courts. Amal Clooney and Ken Roth have each brought about remarkable progress by shining light onto the darkest corners of the human experience, bringing the suffering out of the shadows and into the light, in from the margins and into the center of civil society. By applying the rule of law, by delivering justice through accountability, where justice, in Amal's words, can be waged. We know these are dark days, and there are more ahead, but we've been at this work long enough to know that the fight is worth it. Recall the words of a bright young poet on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, only days after the seat of American democracy was overrun by rioters, determined to destroy the peaceful transition of power. We cannot become what we cannot see, Amanda Gorman reminded the world. There is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. As Amal and Ken and all of our speakers have asked and demanded, are we brave enough to see the world as it is? Are we strong enough to fight to sustain the gains of the human rights movement? Are we smart enough to use all of the tools of law? And are we wise enough to embrace our shared humanity, to be the global human rights movement worthy of the name? A movement born 74 years ago and built through activism, advocacy, financial support, and shared progress, thriving today despite setbacks and blowback, ready to take on current and future challenges, and capable of achieving a world of justice through accountability, with peace and dignity for all.
Thank you for joining us to commemorate Human Rights Day 2022. Our call to action is simple. As Amal and Ken and all of our speakers articulate so clearly and demand so profoundly, bear witness to the world as it is, amplify the words and actions of the champions of justice, and support the work of those fighting for accountability. Next year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a milestone of great significance and profound possibility. We would be honored if you would join us in pursuit of our goals for Human Rights Day 2023. To achieve a more robust understanding of the history, intent, urgency, and relevancy of the 1948 UDHR. To understand the strategies, the methods, and tactics that can be employed to realize deeper and broader human rights over the next 25 years. To lift up the rising youth movements, emerging leaders, and grassroots communities who will carry the human rights movement forward, and to connect the new and established human rights leaders to share lessons and forge bonds to strengthen the continued work of the human rights movement. Imagine a world that re-engages with the moral clarity of the 1948 UDHR, a world that sees things clearly, learns from history, stands together, and responds to the challenge of realizing a more just world. As we look ahead to the 75th anniversary next December 10th, we hope you will help us shape a better world, sharpen our tools, and lift up the leaders to chart a path forward to 2048 with hope, possibility, and moral imagination as our guide. Until we meet again in San Francisco, thank you for joining us.
So I lift my hands to the God that guides me, to the one that finds me. Even in my darkest days, he walks beside me singing songs of freedom, always singing songs of life. And they're leading me out of the darkness, and they're bringing me into the light. Hey, he never said it would be easy. No, he never said we would be safe. My hope, my hope, my hope, hope. Ooh, 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 oh, 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 hope. My hope, my hope, my hope, hope. Ooh, 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 oh, oh, oh. Long live the people that don't feel equal, working hard to pay the wages of this playing in casinos. Long live the ones on the run. I hope they find the love they're looking for and purpose they've been running from. My hope, my hope, you're my world, you're my hope. Ooh, 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 oh, 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 oh. There is hope in every situation, all this pain I'm facing. For every dream I'm chasing, there's hope. Whoa, oh, 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 oh. There is hope in every situation.